Lev Vygotsky was born in Gomel, Belarus in 1896. Growing up as a Jewish boy in this part of Russia, Vygotsky was fascinated with the power of words. From 1913 to 1917, he studied at Moscow State University, where he received a law degree. At the same time, he was auditing classes in the Historical Philosophical Department at Chernivtsi Open University. After graduation, he returned home to Gomel and worked with children who had become homeless because of the civil wars in the area. He began his work in psychology in 1923 when he founded a psychological laboratory. In 1924, he returned to Moscow, where he became a researcher at the Institute of Psychology. He worked with children with disabilities and was chosen to represent the Soviet Union at an international conference on education in 1925. Upon his return, he was hospitalized with tuberculosis and stayed in the hospital for nearly 6 months. He remained out of work for all of 1926, which allowed him plenty of time to develop thought-provoking manuscripts. According to his collaborator, Alexander Luria, Vygotsky knew all the Russian and Western psychologies of the time. He had read, reviewed, and digested all of the major works. After doing so, he said that there was a crisis in psychology because of the inept methodologies being employed that were rooted in misguided theories that split the physical and mental aspects of humans. He wanted to better understand the relationship between thought and word, between thinking and speech. He felt that creating a dichotomy between the two was not the correct way to understand the relationship. He understood that thought and word were fused, and instead of being two independent functions, he saw them as interdependent. He wanted to explore word meaning. He was critical of the work of Jean Piaget. Both Piaget and Vygotsky discussed the idea of egocentric speech. Piaget said that it was used as a transition from individual speech to social speech. Vygotsky said Piaget had it backwards, and that our first speech was rooted in social aspects of development, and through egocentric speech we move toward inner speech or individual speech. He said, the actual movement and development of the child's thinking occurs not from the individual to some state of socialization, but from the social to the individual. As is evident by his disagreement with Piaget's approach, Vygotsky saw human development as being culturally influenced by social activities. By the start of the 1930s, the Soviet Union was undergoing major changes. Joseph Stalin was now in power, and everything turned to collectivization and renationalization. State power's role in science really increased. According to Anton Yestinsky, this time was marked by a growing control over scientific research that culminated in rigid patron-client relations between the ruling Bolshevik bureaucracy and the scientific establishment. Bolshevik support for the study of psychology and like fields dried up, and so did Vygotsky's ability to get his studies published. He also had trouble getting work and ended up having to commute from Moscow to Leningrad, a short 400-mile trip. He began teaching at Leningrad State Pedagogical Institute. He continued to be interested in the relationship between speech and thinking. He said that speech comes first as a form of social interaction, that speech and thinking are two separate processes that converge. Then thinking becomes verbal, and speech becomes intellectual. He said, the structure of speech that the child masters becomes the basic structure of his thinking. He was also interested in concept development and critical of earlier research in this area. Vygotsky said that research had investigated the product of concept development, but not the process. He identified 3 stages of concept development. By the end of 1933, things were looking up for Vygotsky. He was appointed as the head of the Department of Clinical Psychology at the All-Union Institute of Experimental Medicine in Moscow. Unfortunately, his tenure there was short-lived, as he died from tuberculosis in 1934. Because of his untimely death, the scattering of his colleagues, and the semi-official ban on his works after his death, modern authors and theorists recognize the interpretations of Vygotsky's work are varied. The most noted modern-day concept that can be recognized in education is Vygotsky's idea of the zone of proximal development. This idea came out of his interest in the relationship between instruction and learning and was rooted in his work in development. He noted, the state of development is never defined only by what is matured. If the gardener decides to only evaluate the matured or harvested fruits of the apple tree, he cannot determine the state of his orchard. Maturing trees must also be taken into consideration. He said the zone of proximal development has more significance for the dynamics of intellectual development and for the success of instruction than does the actual level of development. The teacher must orient his work not on yesterday's development in the child's, but on tomorrow. Indeed, Vygotsky noted that instructors should note a child's current limits, assist the child through demonstration and leading questions, and by introducing initial elements that will help with the task's solution. What the child can do only with collaboration today, she can do independently tomorrow. Here's a simple diagram of the zone of proximal development. In the center is what I can do without assistance. On the very edges, you can see what I can't do. And in the middle is the zone where, with help, I can develop and learn. Although Vygotsky never used the term scaffolding, it is commonly associated with the idea of the zone of proximal development. Scaffolding is a teaching method that allows instructors to meet learners where they are, provide targeted assistance through modeling or coaching, and then make space for the learners to complete the task or learning objective on their own. Vygotsky's most famous work, Thinking and Speech, came out in Russia in 1937, but was not published in English until 1987, when it came out under the title Thought and Language. As you can see from Scaffolding, 80 years after his death, Vygotsky is still influential. Thanks for watching this brief video on Lev Vygotsky.